Last year, Greece celebrated 200 years since the beginning of our War of Independence. And in a very strange but interesting twist of historical fate, it was the Greek people who were inspired by the foundation of American democracy when they rose against their oppressor to fight for their own freedom. What you had shown us by example, is that liberty can actually be fought for, and even against the odds, won. We understood the founding of your republic to be a watershed in the history of the world, a model for the oppressed nations of Europe, a hope for our own future. Right from the start, therefore, our forefathers looked across the Atlantic for support. From the distant Peloponnese, the leaders of the Greek Revolution sent an appeal in the spring of 1821 to the American people, their friends, their fellow citizens, and brethren. They spoke of the natural sympathy the Greeks felt for Americans, the thirst for freedom that they had both derived from the Asians. They wrote at the time, "In imitating you, we imitate our own ancestors. We shall show ourselves worthy of them in proportion as we resemble you."
For most Greeks around the world, the story of the Greek Revolution is one of the ragtag heroes who took up the call, freedom or death, and fought the Ottomans against all the odds, eventually winning Greeks their independence after 400 years of Ottoman occupation. This is one part of the story. If we take a step back, however, we'll also see the story is much more complex, reaching the power centers of Europe and sweeping across the globe to the United States. I'm Thanos Davelis, and today on the Greek Current Cafe, we're digging into this lesser-known dimension of the Greek Revolution with leading historians Roderick Beaton and Maureen Santelli. Roderick, I want to kick off with you. Was March 25th, 1821 not just a turning point in Greek history, but also world history?
Well, I believe that it was, because it was the beginning of the first revolutionary movement in the old world of Europe that actually succeeded. As you know, there was the French Revolution in 1789, which led to the Napoleonic Wars and a great deal of catastrophe in Europe, but it ended with the restoration of the old monarchical system throughout Europe. And in 1820 and 1821, there was a series of revolutionary movements in southern Europe, really against that restored regime. Every one of them failed, except the Greek Revolution, which in that way led to a change of the whole map, the whole nature of the European continent.
Maureen, looking at this from the perspective of the United States, how important is it that we consider this global angle when we look at the Greek Revolution?
I think that, at least in terms of the role of the Greek Revolution in the imaginations of the United States, I think that the Greek Revolution was sort of proof positive that this age of revolutions was something that was going to keep marching on. For many Americans, they felt that this was proof positive, that this was the wave of the future. And it energized various reform groups in the United States to believe that change was possible, truly dramatic change, including addressing issues in the United States that included the ongoing problems with slavery.
Roderick, I want to turn back to you. When we look at this struggle for Greek independence, you mentioned these great powers, you mentioned the Ancien regime that was in place. Especially in its early days, how was the Greek Revolution viewed in the power centers of Europe, be it Paris, London, or Moscow?
Oh, with absolute horror. There is no question about it. And there was a conference of the great powers that, as it happened, was going on very shortly afterwards in 1822 in today's Slovenia. And the Greeks actually tried to send representatives, and they were turned back. They were told they could not address the representatives of the great powers of Europe. And even Britain, which quite rapidly changed its stance, but at the beginning, the Royal Navy were instructed to treat armed Greek merchantmen, ships on the high seas, as pirates. So there are stories of, Greek, the original the Greek Navy from Hydra and Spetses. They could be arrested by the Royal Navy, and they might actually be hanged as pirates. I'm not sure that actually happened, and the policy did change as early as 1823. But the general horror was manifest. It's slightly different in Russia because there is this sort of Russian, or there's the orthodoxy. There's Catherine the Great had previously entertained ambitions of actually taking over the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, and turning it into Tsargrad. So the Russians did have a particular and slightly different interest. But because this was a movement from below, not from above, Tsar Alexander condemned it, just like the other monarchs.
Maureen, what about in the United States? Before we get into the wave of Philhellenism that swept the country, what was the view at the top, in the president's office, in the halls of Congress?
Views were conflicted. I think that there was, on one level, this excitement that the Greeks were rising up against the Ottomans, and there certainly was prevalent sentiment that that's something that should come to pass. However, problematic in the sense that the United States had commercial interests within the Ottoman Empire, and should the United States support revolution in Greece, that was going to greatly disrupt their aspirations for sealing interests with trade.
Roderick, what's the tipping point, especially in these major power centers in Europe, when looking at the revolution in Greece? What changes their mind to eventually say, we will support a free Greek state?
It was a variety of things, but I mean, now that we're in 2025, we're actually exactly 200 years from the lowest point in the fortunes of the Greeks during that revolution. Between February 1825 and late 1826, the revolution actually came very close to being wiped out completely. And this was, so we're in the beginning of what could so easily have been the end game. Ibrahim Pasha from Egypt had landed with his ships. The Rashid Pasha had already retaken much of Greece north of the Isthmus of Corinth, and many people, I think, must have thought it was only a matter of time. This whole thing was going to be over, and it was in this absolute nadir of the fortunes of the Greeks that really two things came together, which I think changed everything. One was when they absolutely were up against it, the Greeks, or at least enough of the Greeks, said, we're not going to give in. They insisted, they kept on fighting, because if they'd given in, then there would have been no sequel. But equally, this was when not the foreign governments, but the peoples of the foreign countries really began to make their voices heard, to the point where in many countries, certainly in Britain and France, throughout the German states and Switzerland and in Russia, people were really urging their governments to support the Greeks. And to the point where actually eventually by 1826, 1827, the governments themselves felt they had to intervene. And so in the spring of 1826, a standing conference was convened in London. And that was the beginning of the process whereby the great powers intervened, intentionally to impose peace, if necessary, by force. And how do you do that?
Well, that's the question that we'll get into, I think, a little bit later. But I want to stick with this wave of support for the Greeks that we saw in Europe and that also spread in the United States. We alluded to it earlier, Maureen. But walk us through, how this Greek fire spreads across America, because that's also the title of your book on the subject. Why is there this explosion of support from Americans in the 1820s, and what does it look like in practice?
So for the Americans, as soon as they first received the news that revolution had broken out in 1821, there was overwhelming popular support. And I think that there was this expectation that the Greeks should succeed given their long history with the origins of democracy. Americans naturally felt that kinship to ancient Greeks. Now, whether they felt that kinship to modern Greeks is maybe disputed, but they certainly felt that the Greeks deserved independence from the Ottomans. And there was mobilization of, like financial support in that early stage. As time sort of marched on, as we were just discussing, to 1824, 1825, as things looked dire for the Greeks, there was a resurgence of interest because, and we see these in countless articles in American newspapers, that the Greeks cannot fail in securing independence. This cannot happen. And so that re-energized the American Philhellenic movement in terms of raising money. They sent clothing. There was this scandal over the purchase of Greek ships on the part of the Greek government, where Americans lobbied the American government to do something about the situation. They ended up purchasing one of 2 ships for the American Navy, which freed up the Greek government to then purchase the other ship. Again, I think the Americans just really felt we have to help this happen. We have to help the Greeks. So, yeah.
Roderick, there was an interesting comment that Maureen made that, a lot of the Philhellenes in America, they felt this affinity with the ancient Greeks that they were, well aware of. They might have studied about, Socrates and Aristotle and Alexander the Great and Pericles. But what's the view in Europe? Is there a disconnect, or what's the reaction when many of these Philhellenes set foot on shore in Greece after having these visions of what ancient Greece would be and coming to the reality in this revolution?
Well, there's certainly a disconnect, because what they find when they get there is nothing like what they read about in their school textbooks. But there's an interesting aspect of this, because for a lot of people, exactly as Maureen was saying about America, it's their education in the classics that really makes them feel this affinity. So a lot of educated Europeans, just like Americans, feel there's something of their own at stake here. But another element, and actually I'd like to ask Maureen if this applies to in the US as well, is the Christian element. It's often, some Philhellenes refer to the battle of the cross against the crescent. And for some enthusiasts, it was a kind of opportunity to rerun the Crusades. In today's more secular world, we find that sort of perhaps less easy to understand. But it was certainly a component of European Philhellenism. I just wonder, Maureen, if that's so in the United States as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, amongst some groups in the United States, there was a reluctance to support aid for war efforts, especially amongst Christian groups that preferred a more nonviolent support of the revolution. So initially there was efforts to then focus on civilians, but many church groups across the United States focused instead on the on the rhetoric about helping the Greek war heroes, instead helping women and children, civilians that have been displaced by war. And that duality in the Philhellenic movement in the United States, I think, is what really helped to maintain that energy throughout the 1820s.
Maybe this is a question for both of you, but I'll turn to Roderick first on it. This wave of Philhellenism that swept the US and Europe led to fundraisers, people traveling to Greece to actually fight, poets and artists participating in the struggle. Just how unprecedented is this in world history for people from around the world to go to fight, someone else's struggle, essentially, without being mercenaries?
Exactly. I can't think of an example before it. There are examples after it, of which perhaps the most famous is the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, where again, people of lots of different nationalities felt in a very fundamental way, that something of their own was at stake. It was, sort of left wing against right wing. But in the Greek Revolution, I can't think of a precedent for that. I mean, there are lots of, as you say, there are lots of stories of mercenaries, and in the 18th century, European armies were mostly made up of mercenaries. So the idea of putting on a uniform, picking up your musket, going off to fight somewhere else is not unusual. But actually doing it off your own bat and for a matter of conscience, rather than in order just to make a living, it seems to me completely unprecedented. At least I can't think of an example before that.
Maureen?
Yeah, likewise, absolutely. I think that the idea of a free Greece based upon this sort of overly romanticized vision of ancient Greece being revived, is certainly energizes this movement. And it's also been said that this is one of the first humanitarian efforts that the American government doesn't officially support the Greeks. It's the American populace that undertakes this major humanitarian effort to support the Greeks. And as we said, there were Americans who went to Greece to fight as well, Samuel Gridley Howe being the most famous, perhaps.
Roderick, in your studies, you've focused a lot on these Philhellenes, primarily Lord Byron, who may be the most famous of all of the Philhellenes that we know of today. And given that, last week we also celebrated World Poetry Day, I want to focus on him for a bit. Can we say that Lord Byron's poetry and his overall contributions really helped to tip the scales in favor of the Greeks?
I think his overall contributions did. I'm not sure that his poems did. One of the odd things about Byron's story is that, there's one poem that everybody quotes where he talks about, the mountains look on Marathon and Marathon looks on the sea. And people quote that, but they always quote it out of context. And I've written about this, and I stick by what I've said, that I really don't believe there's any poem in which Byron categorically says in the poem, I believe or I hope or I wish that Greece should fight for its freedom. He reflects on the condition of the Greeks, and he discusses that both in verse and in prose. But he never actually writes the kind of, what you might call patriotic or, a sort of tub-thumping, martial kind of poetry. He doesn't write in favor of the Greeks in the way that even that his friend and fellow poet Percy Shelley did. It was something that came to Byron really quite late in his short life, in his 30s, when he took up the cause of Greek independence. And the way I see it is a turn. He goes to Greece not so much as a poet. I mean, certainly his fame is based on his poetry and also on his private life, and his fame is part of the effect that he had. But I believe his intention in going to Greece was actually to transform himself into something rather different and actually take on an active role. It's a very rare case. Talking about Poetry Day, we think about poetry and politics, or poetry and action in the world. And how often do poets actually change things in the world? Byron, I think, is a very rare example of a poet who actively tried, and albeit inadvertently through the tragic accident of his death, actually did.
No, I want to stick with the theme of the Philhellenes, Maureen, and obviously Lord Byron, as we mentioned, maybe one of the most famous from the era. But like you said, there were many Americans who made their way to Greece to fight, and they ended up publishing their experiences, writing their own poetry, maybe creating their own art as well. What's their story?
I think the most famous American Philhellene, as I said earlier, is Samuel Gridley Howe, who had just graduated from medical school and was caught up in the Philhellenic craze, and decided that he wanted to go help the Greeks in his capacity as a doctor. But I think that there's also that sort of romantic element there, that he wanted to help the Greeks achieve independence. There's also Jonathan Peckham Miller, as well as John Jarvis, all Americans who go to serve in the Greek army. The three of them together worked in concert with American Philhellenic groups to publish articles in American newspapers to, again, continue the popular support for the Greeks, to raise funds. Interestingly enough, all three of them, or at least I think all three of them, wrote to other Americans who were interested in serving in the Greek army, basically discouraged them, saying, this is not what you're expecting that it's going to be. We would much rather you stay at home and continue to advance raising funds for the Greeks. So they essentially end up being the mouthpieces for the American Philhellenic movement on the ground.
Moving us from Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, could I jump in there, Thanos? Because
absolutely,
I think just now about the people in what we call the home front, the people back at home. In many ways, I would argue that these are the most effective of the Philhellenes. It was a tiny minority who actually went to Greece from Europe. I mean, about 1,000, I think, went from Europe altogether. But there were many thousands of Europeans all over the continent who, the women knitted socks, the men raised money, and they organized pressure groups and endless sort of cafe meetings, clandestine meetings, pressure groups, writing pamphlets, public speaking, soapbox kind of things. It was kind of popular politics, and there were thousands, probably tens of thousands of those people, and they were doubtless, I mean, they were inspired by the example of the rather small number who went to Greece. But I think there's a case for saying that it was actually those ones in the behind the sort of backroom Philhellenes who perhaps were the more effective after all. Sorry to interrupt that.
Oh, well, and in fact, if I could chime in, American women. And you could argue, especially in northern states, but there certainly were women in southern, more populous areas in the South, were sort of the backbone of the American Philhellenic movement. And they are specifically named in a number of publications as being the foundation of the Philhellenic movement because of their gathering and producing clothing and raising funds, etc. So I absolutely would agree with that.
I want to turn us from the Philhellenes to the Greeks themselves, wherever they might be, because I think this is an important note to make. It wasn't just the Greeks that were in mainland Greece or where the fighting was taking place, but across diaspora communities that were driving this fight for independence. And while the Americans or other Europeans had this wave of Philhellenism sweep across them, many of these Greeks were inspired in turn by, the French Revolution, the American Revolution before that. Maureen, when we look at the American Revolution here, how important is it to dig into its impact, especially when talking about the Greek War of Independence?
The American Revolution is almost always used as a comparison in American articles. And there's, of course, lots of amateur American poetry that's published in newspapers supporting the Greeks. And it's used as a mechanism to garner support for the Greeks, that they are fighting their own revolution. We were one of the first to achieve independence, so we are obligated and bound to help the Greeks out. Greek heroes, and including female Greek heroes, are written about in these articles, and we see connections made to American men and women in the American Revolution, drawing comparisons between the two to essentially, again, like our George Washington's, they have their similar figures, and we need to support them on those grounds that we have that deep connection with revolutionary endeavors.
Roderick, can you talk about how these global events help to shape the discourse and the thoughts of Greek revolutionary heroes?
Well, I think those who were, I mean, many of those were people who had been. Well, I mean, you were talking about Greeks who were living in Europe, and then they left wherever they were, and they went. They too, but well, like the Philhellenes, they actually went from other places in Europe to Greece to take up arms, because, I mean, as I think your question already made clear, there were quite a significant number of young male Greeks studying in universities, possibly high schools too, in many other parts of Europe, and some of the sort of political tract, some of the ideology that is actually written down that we can read today, is actually produced by those, and apparently written for them as well. So there's a wonderful, rather extreme, rather bloodthirsty tract published in Italy, somewhere in Italy, anonymously in 1806. So quite a while before things actually start happening, in which it calls upon the students and the engineers and the craftsmen who are in Europe all to go back to the mother country, to take up arms and to fight for its liberation. So that again is another way in which Greeks themselves are becoming enmeshed with the rest of Europe, so that when these people go back to Greece, they're bringing something of Europe back with them.
I want to stick with this story of the diaspora because it's a critical part of the whole narrative. Roderick, as a follow-up here, just how important is the diaspora when we talk about the success of the revolution? I know it starts with the Philhellenes, the secret society that's formed in a place that's now in modern Ukraine, Odessa.
Exactly. I mean, again, I suppose I have a slight problem with the term diaspora, because I tend to use that term to refer to the post-independence movement of Greeks all over the world in more modern times. In the time we're talking about, in the 1820s, there was a very widespread Greek population throughout many parts of the Ottoman Empire, in southern Russia and in Europe. And are they a diaspora? In some cases, if they've gone to Amsterdam, as Corais did, for example, that's a diaspora. But if you're living in Odessa, your ancestors have been there for hundreds of years, some would say thousands. And the same is true of Anatolia or many parts of the Balkans that are not part of Greece today. So there's a kind of anachronism, I think, when we talk about the diaspora, because there isn't. We need to remember there isn't a Greece to be outside of before the 1832. So I think we're talking about a broader phenomenon of a Greek population that is quite widely spread. So diaspora in that broad sense. And yes, I mean the Philhellenes, it's always said that it was it's supposed to have been founded in Odessa. It has been argued that actually it was in Constantinople and a little bit later, but it was certainly outside, the main theatre of action. A lot of the members of that clandestine society were outside, Greece or even the Balkans. I mentioned that pamphlet that was published probably in Livorno in Italy in 1806. There was Corais, the great sort of man of learning and ideologue of the revolution, living a long time resident in Paris.
Who reportedly was also corresponding with Thomas Jefferson.
Well, I mean, his correspondence indeed survives. They corresponded in French, and that has been published. And there's a large Greek community in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and indeed some in the highest echelons of the Russian civil service. Well, Kapodistrias himself, of course, had shortly before the revolution had been foreign minister of Russia. So there are Greeks in a whole range of places, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Russian Empire, in the Habsburg Empire, in Western Europe. And Maureen, there must be some in the United States as well by that time, are there not?
In terms of the diaspora or the education?
Are there Greek communities in North America by the 1820s?
There are not, although I was going to save this for the end. Thanks to
Sorry.
no, you're fine. Because of the Greek Revolution and Samuel Gridley Howe and others being in Greece, and actually missionaries as well. They are instrumental in bringing Greek children back to the United States. And
Yes. Yeah.
arguably, they become the first Greek Americans that are going to be part of that diaspora. Although more typically, I think when we think of the Greek diaspora in the United States, we don't talk about that until the late 19th century, when we really start to see the first major wave of Greeks moving to the US. But I'll save talking about those early Greeks for the end.
Maureen, I want to follow up with you here because, given that there aren't these big pockets of Greeks living in the United States, it's kind of amazing that the debate reaches the highest level of American society and American government. And, given how we're seeing, to tie it into today a little bit as well, a shift in American foreign policy today, this Greek Revolution took place at a time when the United States was sketching out the Monroe Doctrine, and the Greek Revolution becomes a part of that debate. Can you give us a brief, bullet point outline of how the Greek Revolution shapes American policy at the time?
Yeah. So so Monroe, when he becomes president, and in the midst of the Greek Revolution, his first reaction was, I want to support the Greeks. Let's acknowledge independence. And his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who I think that he did privately want the Greeks to have independence. He was more practical than perhaps Monroe, and saw that as less advantageous for the United States. He wanted to cultivate American commercial interests with the Ottomans, and as I said earlier, doing so supporting Greek independence instead of pursuing commerce was going to undermine those interests. So after much persuading, because again, James Monroe really did want to support the Greeks, he finally was made to see that if the United States wanted to expand their interests abroad, they couldn't support the Greeks. We have to instead toe the line. And so that then becomes part of the conversation directly in the Monroe Doctrine, where James Monroe acknowledges American popular interest in acknowledging Greek independence, but he ultimately says, we're going to put that aside in favor of these other interests. And arguably, the Monroe Doctrine also plays an important part in, again, energizing ongoing popular support for the Greeks, because Americans did not want to accept that.
Roderick,
Can I jump
sticking
in?
with Sure.
Sorry, can I jump in again? Because I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating that it's the very same speech to Congress which is always cited as setting out the Monroe Doctrine, in which the president also says quite categorically that he wishes to see the Greeks win their independence. And particularly with the hindsight, and you were referring to policy changes today, isn't that a fascinating contradiction right at the heart of American exceptionalism? On the one hand, you're creating a Western hemisphere which the Europeans are not meant to interfere with. On the other, we earnestly want to see the Greeks win their independence. And only a few years after that, I think Monroe was probably no longer president, but when an American fleet went to the Mediterranean to deal with the Algerian pirates, there's something about America, the Western Hemisphere not wanting the Europeans to interfere in America, but it doesn't quite work in the opposite direction.
Well, Roderick, I want to stick with you here and this theme of tying the revolution to today, because as we look at the world today with war in Ukraine, we've seen conflict in the Middle East, a shifting power dynamic with the United States seemingly ready to disengage from Europe. What lessons do you think we can draw from 1821?
Well, I mean, I think what I just said is probably actually one of those that 200 years ago, when issues of self-determination and what we now call liberal nationalism were really just sort of becoming established, were really fighting their way to existence in the world, the a large part, not all by any means, but much of Europe and the young United States were actually on the same, were on the same side of, if you like, history. But there are lots of contradictions there, because one of the three powers that helped Greece win their independence was, of course, Tsarist Russia, which is the same power that the the other allies that joined in helping the Greeks win their independence, France and Great Britain, they were part of the dynamics of that were Western Europeans alarm at the expansion of the ambitions of Tsarist Russia. And right through the Stalin, the USSR, and communism, and now the new authoritarian Russia of Vladimir Putin, that dynamic of Western Europe looking east with alarm, remains as potent as ever. And Greece then was right on the, in the firing line. It was right on the front line. And well, where are we today? It's worth wondering about that.
On that note, I want to, as we close out our podcast episode here, turn to our shot clock segment that our regular viewers will be familiar with. As you all know, we have the shot clock in the NBA is 24 seconds to take your shot. You'll have the same amount of time to answer a question that I'll pose to you. And the question is the same for both of you. And I think, Maureen, we can start with you. But who are three people tied to the Greek Revolution, whether Greek or Philhellene, that you think we need to know more about?
I think some of the first Greek Americans brought over by American Philhellenes from the Greek Revolution deserve a lot more attention than they typically receive. Photius Fisk, for example, was a child in the 1820s. He's educated in the United States, and he becomes a minister, and he ends up becoming an ardent abolitionist because of his experiences with the Greek Revolution, going so far as supporting the Secret Six with the Harper's Ferry. Proves to be a debacle, but with John Brown.
We may
Uh,
we may
John's
need to expand our shot clock in the future, but I think those are some great names to think about as we move ahead. Roderick, the floor is yours. Who are three people tied to the Greek Revolution, whether Greek or Philhellene, that you think we need to know more about?
Well, Lord Byron, of course. You can't do without Lord Byron. Next, I would name Alexandros Mavrokordatos, the politician rather than a fighter with whom Byron worked very closely and made a very big contribution that's underrated. And finally, particularly since we're talking to an American audience, I too would name Samuel Gridley Howe, philanthropist and doctor.
All right. It looks like our viewers have a little bit of homework to find some of these names and dig into them. But Maureen, Roderick, it's been great chatting. Thanks again for joining us. And to our viewers, leave us a comment, share our video. We love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us.